When we experience something strange, whether it's being touched by an unseen force, seeing an apparition or a shadow figure, or hearing voices, we tend to either look for validation of that experience, or we try to find an explanation and attempt to categorize what happened. For some of us, these things can be easily dismissed as an act of imagination, a hallucination, or pareidolia, where the human mind assigns context to randomness. While some believe they truly have witnessed evidence of an afterlife, spiritual beings, or angels and demons, others consider the possibility of the presence of mental illness, like schizophrenia, or at least they're readily accused of it. But in reality, not all unexplained phenomena fit perfectly into one of these little boxes. Today's guest specializes in serious mental illness, like schizophrenia, mood disorders, and criminal behavior. He's a licensed psychotherapist and is currently in pursuit of his doctorate in forensic psychology. Michael Drain is his name, and he is also the creator and host of the Unpopular Culture podcast, where he and his crew of professionals dive into the underbelly of today's society. They talk about true crime, the psychology behind the Netflix show Black Mirror, and they break down the psychology of modern society and various conspiracy theories. I have to say that it's a phenomenal show that I've personally subscribed to, and I would encourage any of my listeners to check it out. Hopefully, after spending an hour speaking with me, Michael doesn't think I'm too crazy. Here he is, Michael Drain from the Unpopular Culture podcast. Well, I guess let's just jump in. I'd like to hear a little bit about your professional background, if you can kind of walk us through your schooling and training.
Sure. Okay, so I got into mental health in about 2008, and I started off as a psych tech, which is sort of the foot soldier of the mental health field. Mm-hmm. These people are very hardworking. When the therapist goes home and the psychologist goes home and everybody goes home, the psych tech is the one that stays with the patients, especially in a mental hospital setting is where I always worked. So 24/7, you're part therapist, part security guard, part friend, part, coordinator, event coordinator, as far as helping to coordinate activities and groups and therapy and getting them from A to B. And a lot of these places are locked down. So even transferring from one room to another within a mental hospital is an ordeal that involves electronic keys and moving everybody at once and coordinating with the rest of the hospital. And, not all mental health issues are created equal. So you definitely have the more sick individuals, and those people can sadly be pretty dangerous at times to self and others. I had a friend that used to call himself a human punching bag. So, and it's certainly true, especially in the more high acuity settings. So I had a lot of baptism by fire when I first started. And it was, I don't know. I feel like I learned more as the ground soldier, the psych tech, almost as much as I did in school, almost as much as I did in my post-grad work. You really, really, really get to know patients at a firsthand level. I got my bachelor's, and I did a couple research projects. At that point, I was still sort of dabbling, figuring out what I wanted to do. Got my bachelor's degree in psychology. I was a grievance counselor for hospice, and I loved it. It was my first exposure to therapy. I would travel to people's homes, but I would also do group therapy within the hospice center. But it was just amazing to work with these people that had lost somebody. One guy was in his 80s and he lost his wife, and he had nobody. He had no friends. It was just him and his wife. And so I had this monumental task, which I was not qualified for, mm-hmm. to try to help this guy, find purpose in life and find himself. And it was, again, baptism by fire. So I guess I've always sort of thrown myself in the deep end.
Well, if I can interrupt you, I've only had a couple of interactions with hospice myself, but I have to say they're amazing. No complaints at all.
Oh yeah. It's very honorable work. And I probably found that to be the most satisfying work I've ever done. People who are grieving really want you to help them. Other other forms of mental illness, addiction, for example, they're fighting you, they're lying to you, they're lying to themselves. It's a tug of war. But grievance is, my heart is broken. It's spilling out all over the floor. Please help me. I'll do whatever you say. Mm-hmm. So it's very, it's easy to work with somebody like that. And the payoff is much better too. They're in such pain, chronic pain, that, just one session will make them come a long way, and you can see a difference at the end of the session. And then when they're looking forward to the next one. So it's, I recommend it to friends who are going through school for psychology now. I think it's a great place to start. It's also something you can do as an undergrad, and your options for therapy are pretty limited at that point. You're not really qualified. But at hospice, they set it up so that you're essentially a volunteer. So anybody could technically go do these home visits and stuff, but I had attempted to do it from a more therapeutic model. I would sit in the library and study for hours about grievance counseling and how to tackle these issues, and sort of took it from that approach. I did some research projects when I was in my undergrad. I did one on non-epileptic seizures, mm-hmm. And then I did another one on proximity to your partner, your wife or spouse or husband or whatever, as it relates to stress. So we would put somebody in a room and we would expose them to stressful situations, usually by reading certain things that were meant to be triggering. And we would have 3 different conditions where they would be alone in the room while they were subjected to stress. Then their partner would be in the room, and then their partner would be in the room. And the third variable, their partner would be in the room, but they would have their hand on your leg or your shoulder, touching you in some way, and then monitoring the levels of stress that and how sense of touch affected it.
That's interesting. That reminds me of Ghostbusters 2, when I think they were elevating the temperature in the room and watching that couple argue. I don't know if you remember that. That's pretty old school.
No, Vigo. Oh, geez, what else can I tell you? My master's, that's when things got pretty intense. As I was finishing my master's, I was still a psych tech, but I worked at a state hospital, and eventually I switched over to being an intern there as a psychotherapist. So my patients were from the forensic hospital, so people who were found to be criminally guilty for a crime, horrible crimes, murder, you name it, but they were also found to be insane at the time. So it's called guilty except insane. At least it was in Arizona. Mm-hmm. And it's probably the modern day or realistic equivalent to the insanity plea is what people would probably know it as. Right. But then sex offender patients, and finally the civil hospital, which is the sickest of the sick. People who are so chronically mentally ill that they are in the hospital for 30 years, and really we don't have the technology or ability to really help them. All we can really do is keep them medicated and try to keep them safe. And it's sad, but that's their life. They the inside of walls, because they're such a danger to themselves, they'll literally kill themselves the second you take your eye off of them. So these were my patients. My first patient, I was responsible for restoring a guy to competency after so he could stand trial for murder. So I really had some, and then everybody else in my graduating class was working in a clinic for marriage and family therapy or something, which is great work. Don't get me wrong, but our experiences were not the same. So I would always come to class and try to share my experiences, and nobody could really relate or help. Mm-hmm. So I was sort of on my own, but and then in my career, I guess so far I focus on assessment and diagnosis of seriously mentally ill. So somebody will come into a mental hospital that I work at, and they will be suicidal, homicidal, psychotic, or some combination of all of that. And my job would be to assess them, make a provisional diagnosis, and then make recommendations as to, oh, you should come into the hospital, you need immediate treatment, or let's get you into outpatient therapy. And then finally, I moved into mobile assessments and diagnosis. So I worked for a company that I would go to emergency rooms. A doctor would have somebody coming into an emergency room, and same situation, they'd be psychotic or they'd be homicidal, and the medical staff wouldn't really know what to do with that, so they would order a psych evaluation, and then I would come and perform my assessment, make a diagnosis, get them into a mental hospital. Same thing. Mm-hmm. So that's where I've been at so far. That's about my career in a nutshell.
Well, in my line of work, I may have actually run into some of your counterparts doing that. So I have met a few people that do that. They're always third party, and in the ER, like you said.
Right.
Well, I love how you're tying your professional background into your podcast. So for my listeners who aren't familiar with the Unpopular Culture podcast, can you kind of give us a little summary of what your show's about?
I would love to. Unpopular Culture opened on October 11th, 2016, and we have been hitting the ground running ever since. I've always wanted to do a podcast, and once I had gone through school, the theme sort of found itself, and then I just jumped in, decided to do it. I take a lot of inspiration from, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. I just love the guy. I love the way he talks, the way he speaks. So the first 10 episodes we did, a lot of them are, I take inspiration from that, but I also try to be more hip, more current. We do music, and we do try to provide an entertainment value, but also be educational and informative and do our homework, and everything you say is legitimate psychology that's backed up by facts. So our motto is essentially we uncover the seedy underbelly of society. We try to tackle topics that most people don't, and we get a lot of praise about that from our listeners, people that just love that. We cover things like the most recent episode we did, our season 2 launch, is about the 5 different types of stalker behavior, for example. So anything from somebody who is in love with you and doesn't understand that you're not in love with them. We cover John Hinckley, the guy that shot Reagan, for example. But then we had an episode about generations that was really popular, the different generation gaps, millennials versus Gen Xers versus baby boomers. So we try to cover it all. We just whatever we find interesting. Whatever I find interesting, I'll take it a topic, and I'll spend obsessive amount of time crafting and scripting and refining, and eventually when I feel like I have a good product, I'll put it out there.
Yeah, no, I listened to the generational one that you had out, and I gotta say, I kind of felt, walking through my own personal feelings about it, I felt like, gosh, you need more people commenting, and I know you've got a lot of feedback on that, but I kept being like, a little bothered by what was being said. And then if I think about it, I'm like, well, there's truth in that, but it was so much more about just understanding the other perspective.
Absolutely. And, I didn't think much of it when we recorded that. We didn't know that it was going to be such a popular episode. And we had originally an idea to have representation from all the different generations. Mm-hmm. I was going to bring Gen Xers. I was going to bring baby boomers. And because of scheduling and stuff, it just didn't work out. So we wound up being a table full of millennials talking about, all the different generations. And it's absolutely a fair assessment to say that not all the generations are represented. And I tried to do a unbiased, fair job. But, at the end of the day, I just am not a baby boomer. I am just not a Gen Xer. So I would love to redo that episode, and we've had some requests, and I am giving it some thought, trying to redo that episode more balanced. Because how great would that be? A different character from every generation representing and contributing. It would be a very rich experience. So it's something I would not rule out.
Yeah, and if you need a volunteer Gen Xer, I'm your guy. I do applaud you for putting it out there, though. There's so many people that just refuse to talk about it, and it's actually something that a lot of workforce relations or departments are getting managers and leadership out there to try to understand, and there's still a lot of standoffishness. So thanks for your efforts in putting it out there and opening the discussion.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it was a pleasure. It was a really good episode. I'm shocked. I'm still surprised to see the numbers on that one and how popular it is. It wound up being one of our most popular episodes. So yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
Sure, sure. So let's switch gears.
Sure.
This show's about the paranormal, and I have a lot of listeners who believe in the paranormal and have had experiences like myself, and then there's a lot of people who, email me and just don't believe that any of this stuff exists.
Yeah.
Every occurrence can be explained or lumped into some kind of a misperception or psychological disorder, and I guess I don't know. Before I ask too many questions, where do you stand on paranormal phenomena?
It's a fair question. I I guess I would have to, if I had to sum it up in a word, I'd say I take a sort of agnostic view about the paranormal. Um, it's complicated. I've had my own experiences. I've had my own things that I have seen.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to rule something out completely. Anybody who says that they know definitively that this stuff does not exist is lying. There's absolutely no way to prove or disprove at this point that paranormal activity is a thing. Strong evidence would suggest the fact that it's been reported throughout generations, throughout different cultures, all over the world, all throughout time. People have recorded sightings of ghosts, apparitions. It's in our religion. You think of the Holy Ghost, you think of in Christianity, visions, Mary seeing a ghost, saying you're going to have a baby, that sort of thing. This is something that as a society we're sort of dichotomous about, because on one hand we fully accept it as long as it's in the concept of a religious ideology, then it's fully accepted. But at the same time, if somebody said, I saw a ghost and I had a conversation with them in my living room, you would think, well, you're crazy, you're schizophrenic. And then at the same time, if somebody said, well, I got down on my knees and I prayed and I had a conversation with the Holy Ghost. Mm-hmm. Well, now all of a sudden it's like, oh, yes, okay, I see. Well, good for you. Completely same thing in my view. And, we're all about offending people with our raw, blunt force commentary. So I apologize to your listeners if I'm crossing lines here. But there's so many things that can't be explained. X-rays exist, and we didn't know they were there until some time ago. Microwaves exist. We can't see them, but they exist nonetheless. Ultraviolet light, we can't see it, but it exists nonetheless. So if you're going off of what's real based on your five senses, what you can see and touch and smell and taste and hear, those really are a poor indicator of what's in your environment around you. So anybody who's just taking measure of the world by your limited, very limited senses is, you can't see bacteria, but it's there. There's countless examples. You can't see gravity, but you can feel the effects, time, things like this. So it's impossible to rule it out. I suppose I take an agnostic view about that.
Well, and I guess I appreciate you saying that. I can't speak for all of my listeners, but I can speak for myself when I say, if people can just admit that there's things that you can't explain, I think that's all anybody ever really wants, for the most part. And then there's people at the extreme end of the spectrum that want you to agree that you have psychic ability, and there's a spectrum, obviously, but
yeah.
I'm very interested to hear what kinds of experiences you've had that you have been unable to explain.
Okay. Well, when I was younger, I was very close to my grandfather, who passed away some years ago. And shortly after his death, my family, we had a shared experience, I guess you could call it. I had a dream one night that, and this was fresh after he had passed away. I was grieving. I was not in a great place. I had a dream that he was standing there. It was all white in the background. He was wearing his jeans and a white shirt, which is exactly what he would be wearing. And he didn't say anything, which was very weird because it's not like him to not do that. And somehow from this dream, I absorbed the understanding without him saying a word that he's okay and everything's fine. And I felt this sense of comfort from that. And, I should say I'm not a religious person at all. So I guess I seek spiritual answers, but I don't identify with any kind of religious ideology. So it's not that I thought, oh, I'm seeing my grandpa in heaven or anything like that. I honestly didn't know what to think. But I was grateful for the experience because it left me feeling better. Well, it turns out I talked to my dad about it, and this would be my dad would be my grandfather's son. And he said, oh my God, I had the exact same dream. And I talked to my grandma, his wife, same dream. And she is hardcore Christian. She has a very different ideology than I do. And yet we had the same dream, so you can't blame it on ideology or religious view. If you have somebody who is what I would consider myself an agnostic, and somebody like her who is a devout Christian, goes to church 3 times a week for the last 50 years, having the same experience, that sort of rules out any kind of cultural explanation. Mm-hmm. And then another thing is I was sitting there shortly after, once again, this is probably a different day, and I was sitting there playing a guitar in my room. My dad was over, and I didn't know this, but he had stepped out of the house and gone somewhere. And I sat there and playing my guitar thinking that he was still in the house. And I had felt something standing behind me, somebody standing behind me, and it didn't concern me at all, to the point I was so convinced that somebody was standing behind me that it didn't alarm me in any way. I just assumed it was my dad standing there over me, watching me play guitar. Mm-hmm. And later find out that he wasn't there. He hadn't been in the house at all. So wow. And then you take those accounts and realize that it's very localized to right around when my grandfather passed away. These aren't occurrences that I experience regularly, or before or since or what have you. So that if it was chronic, if I had been saying this every day or at least every couple of days, I'm seeing things, I'm hearing things, you might need a psych evaluation possibly, or at least to rule that out. But for somebody who has no history of mental illness and no history of seeing or hearing things, and then suddenly to go through this, and then of course even within that there's a psychological explanation. So it really is tricky. But these are things that I have experienced that I just can't explain. And I'm sort of in a twisted way. I think I'm grateful for the experience. I think, although I don't necessarily believe in an afterlife or what have you, it's nice to know. It's nice to have felt that, to buy into that, if only temporarily, as a way to comfort myself for grieving over his death. And perhaps that's what my mind did, was make all that up as a grieving mechanism in the first place. Or maybe it's real. There's simply no way to know.
And you're not feeling compelled one way or another to try to find answers behind that?
Well, I don't think I would know where to start. It's my understanding that I know there are paranormal groups, and I've actually participated in those, where you take, equipment, cameras, and electronic monitoring devices to an old house, an old hotel, and that is a blast because it's so fascinating and spooky and all that. But beyond that, I wouldn't know where to begin. I suppose I could start taking pictures in a house, trying to capture something, or maybe an audio recording, trying to capture something there. I've never taken it that far, to be honest.
Well, and I can tell you I have, and it doesn't matter what type of evidence you collect. There's always going to be an element, if somebody wasn't there to experience it with you, of saying, that's easily faked. And they're right. It's how are they supposed to validate your results when they're not in the situation themselves?
Right.
It's an impossible task, I think. Well, how often would you say that you come into contact with maybe patients who've had experiences similar to yours?
Oh, all the time, every day, which is why I feel a bias towards a scientific explanation. I feel a pull to dismiss it as schizophrenia or some form of mental illness, because within psychology, there's a number of different ways you could get to a point where you are seeing and hearing things that aren't there.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to fully commit to that. I don't think psychology is the end all be all answer. I think it's just another field of science that's attempting to understand things. So, but my mind automatically goes there. But to answer your question, I see that every day. I constantly have patients who are, and in fact, within schizophrenia, there's a religious component where they will directly claim to see ghosts or see angels or demons or what have you. That's extraordinarily common.
Have you ever been tempted to believe one of those accounts when maybe it was difficult to diagnose a disorder?
Yeah. I mean, there's certain things that you just can't explain. I remember one girl early on in my career. She was very mentally ill, to the point where she didn't have much ability to communicate. She could say basic words and stuff, but she was pretty low functioning. Um, I said mentally ill, but I mean mentally challenged.
Okay.
But she also was mentally ill. She seemed schizophrenic to me, but it's hard to tell because you couldn't get a lot of feedback from her. But she always seemed to be responding to internal stimuli, meaning she would seem to be talking to herself. Her eyes would be darting. She'd be looking inward. And one day I was walking by her, just happened to be walking by her, and I hear her saying some things to herself. And as I walk by, she goes, "There goes the devil." And something about it just sent a chill up my spine, because this girl never talks, never says a word. And there you have it, just all of a sudden out of nowhere. And
yeah, that's creepy.
Yeah, yes, it was. And then if you look at history, you can see, mentally ill people were burned at the stake as heretics, as demons and witches at one point. People who would claim to see things that would go against the establishment religion at the time were burned in effigy. So you can't exactly take a fair view about it. It really does depend. It really does depend on the macro society that you live in and how they perceive this sort of thing. And unfortunately, or fortunately, our society has popularized, ghost hunters, and all these shows have sort of popularized. And I think on one hand, they bring light to paranormal activity. And then on another hand, some of those shows to me seem to be fabricated, seem to trivialize a lot of what's happening. So, I wouldn't want to do damage to the field. I applaud people who are attempting to find answers regarding paranormal activity. I like that. I applaud that, because there is something there. There are things that happen that we cannot explain, and it's only scientific to continue to try to seek the answers.
Well, and this kind of brings up another line of question, I guess, with people who are purposefully being deceptive about what claims they have or what evidence they produce. Why would somebody, just from your professional perspective, why would somebody choose to fake some of these occurrences?
Sometimes somebody with schizophrenia and maybe some sort of personality disorder, that combination, and I'll explain what that is, I guess. People with a personality disorder, some kinds will be dependent on other people. They engage in, and a lot of my colleagues will hate me for saying this, but they will engage in attention-seeking behaviors, things to bring attention to themselves. And it's not because they're bad people or anything. Normally, it's because they had a very messed up childhood. They didn't get a lot of love and affection as kids. And so as adults, they are seeking that attention in very screwed up ways. And so they will create situations. They'll fake a sprained ankle, or they'll fake a seizure, or, the sky's the limit. And they'll do these things because when they know when that happens, all the hospital staff will come rushing to them to look after them. And that's what they're really after. So somebody with schizophrenia, somebody with schizophrenia who knows they have schizophrenia, who knows that they have delusions and they have hallucinations, and they know that all the staff knows that too. Can, but not always. I don't want to frame everybody like this because it's certainly not universal, but I have seen cases where they'll be compensated, meaning they'll be on medication, they'll be stable, they'll be not experiencing hallucinations in that moment, but then we'll fake it to get, whatever you can imagine. Mostly the bottom line is attention and comfort from other people.
Now, I'm going to kind of dive into the Fray episode that I was on here. If for my listeners who haven't heard it, I did an interview on Into the Fray where I described some creatures that I personally witnessed over a 2-week period when I lived in Arizona. And you did mention to me before the show that you had a chance to listen to that episode. So
I did, yeah.
I guess how would you break that down if I was your patient?
Well, if you had come in to see me, I would automatically be looking at you from a perspective of evaluating you for mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
So I would already be looking at you from that point of view. And, we try to be neutral and impartial. We try not to rule things out. So you would you mind recapping just a little bit?
Yeah, I feel that's probably fair if people haven't heard that. Just a brief summary. This was during a time where my daughter was still pretty newly born, probably within the first 6 months of her life, and hadn't been getting a lot of sleep. But I had seen this thing basically driving home from work a few times, and there the freeway, I remember it was Highway 60. I looked over. There was somebody trying to merge into the lane next to me, and when I kind of looked over just to see what they were doing, I noticed this thing in the background that it looked to be 7 or 8 feet tall, very tall. It looked like a black figure, cloaked. It had a hood, and I thought it was kind of some kind of like Halloween prop until it moved. And, it really caught me off guard. It shocked me. I kind of, went home. It was only there for a few seconds. I went home, and this kind of event occurred several times over the next 2 weeks from that point, to the point where I was questioning my sanity. I was actually seeking help. I went to I believe he was a psychologist, and was basically told, that it was sleep deprivation had caused some kind of hallucination. But I think to this day, what kills me is I don't, I've had sleep deprivation since then. My situation regarding sleep deprivation has not changed. And that only occurred during that 2-week period. So, obviously I've had other paranormal experiences, but that was the one that stuck out to me as the only thing that's really been frightening, or it's unlike the others, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. So if you had come in to see me, the first thing I would do is start ruling out any possibilities. So that would include a drug screen. Not knowing you as a guy off the street, I would screen you for amphetamines or any other, some of those really hardcore drugs can permanently fry your brain to the point where you're permanently schizophrenic. Mm-hmm. If you came in talking to me as you're talking to me now, that would not be my first theory, but I would rule it out anyway. Mm-hmm. Another thing I might ask you is about a family history of mental illness. If anybody in your close family or even a secondary family, mom, dad, brother, sister, grandpa, grandma, anything like that, had schizophrenia or any kind of depression, bipolar, anything like that. Mm-hmm. And then I would ask you about your daily activities. I would try to figure out, well, have you been drinking? Have you been under any kind of stress? I would ask you about sleep. When you had said that on your episode that the psychologist had diagnosed you with sleep deprivation, I felt very unsatisfied by that.
Well, I did too.
Yeah, and it's tough because you're obviously an intelligent guy with a level head on your shoulder, so it's not like you're coming in screaming and acting totally insane. That would be obvious. Normal, intelligent guy, even keel, comes in, and reports this stuff with a straight face, you start to look for any kind of secondary things. And the truth is, any number of things could have made a cocktail that contributed to your experiences, including the idea that it was something paranormal. I mean, I'm not ruling that out. There's just no classification to diagnose you with. You saw a ghost, you know.
Right.
But the brain has an amazing ability to play tricks on you. It's not hard to fool the brain at all. Your attention is only focused on one thing at a time. Sort of like Lord of the Rings, the Eye of Mordor. You know, it can only look at one thing at a time. Mm-hmm. And that's you. That's your attention. Right now you're focused on this conversation with me, but you're not really feeling the sensation in, let's say, the bottom of your feet right now, or how your arm feels against the chair you might be sitting in. Your brain is open to these sensations, but you're not focused on them. That doesn't mean they're not there, but the brain can't process everything at once. So it takes shortcuts. Visually, this will come into play if you see something out of your peripheral. For example, you're focusing, talking to somebody, and you're having a conversation with somebody, and in your peripheral, you see a person, and it startles you, and you look to the left, and it turns out it's a coat hanging on a rack. Well, your brain was taking a shortcut. It was on some subconscious level registering a figure that you could sort of see, but were not paying attention to, and your brain took a shortcut by inserting information that it already understands. It went, oh, person, that's a person. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until you took your attention and diverted it to that it became real. That's not your experience necessarily. And then sleep deprivation, yeah, kind of, but really you don't start hallucinating from sleep deprivation unless had you been up for 3 days straight or anything like that.
Well,
just talking about
this was basically, I mean, yeah, you could say that. I was getting maybe 1 to 2 hours of sleep a night, and that continued for years. You know, I had I have a really tough time going back to sleep once I'm awake, and when I have to set an alarm to get up, you know, I can wake up, and if I try to go back to sleep 10 seconds later, I can do it. But if I have to get up and spend 10 minutes giving medications or, you know, walking around the house and doing things, I'm never going to go back to sleep. So this actually carried on for several years, but it was only in the first 6 months that I had this particular experience.
Okay, so in the beginning of this several year stint of not sleeping very well, an hour or two a night, you had, within the first 6 months of that, you had some experiences. Mm-hmm. Then they dropped off. So from that, I would be that is evidence that, to me, that sleep deprivation might have played a role, and it may be that your brain simply got used to the lack of sleep after 6 months. You sort of accommodated to it. Were there any stressors in your life? Anything out of the ordinary going on top of that at the time? Family, emotional, you know, whatever.
Well, the big stressor was we had an
just to put you back on the chair, if it was, it could be, I would take that as another nail in the coffin, as it were. Maybe an egg in the basket. Maybe that's a less dark analogy,
right?
but more evidence. It's possible, because often it's not one thing that would cause this sort of thing. If I was trying to find a psychological, scientific explanation and throw out any kind of paranormal explanation, I might consider the combination of a new, fresh insomniac, somebody who has, within the last several months, recently stopped sleeping as well, 1 to 2 hours a night. I mean, you need at least 2 to complete. It's my understanding you need at least 2 hours to complete one REM cycle of sleep. So really 1 hour is not doing a whole hell of a lot. Mixed with external life stressors, what you went through with your daughter is obviously traumatic and stressful. That creates fear, that creates anxiety, and just fear and anxiety alone can cause hallucinatory behavior. Just that right there. Not in everybody. It depends. Everybody's different. Some people are more susceptible to things. There's diagnoses of schizophrenia called schizoaffective disorder. So it's schizophrenia, but it has a mood component. And it means that you'll be fine. And then, like somebody who's bipolar, you'll go manic or you'll go depressed. And when that happens, when that mood shifts, you also go psychotic. You start to see things that aren't there, hear things that aren't there, feel things that aren't there, believe things that aren't true. And it may be that some people in the world are extremely high functioning schizophrenics, just like you have extremely high functioning autism. Mm-hmm. People who you could have a full blown conversation with them and have no idea that they're on an autism spectrum. It may be that some of us among the population are susceptible to hallucinatory behavior when we're triggered to stress, or when we don't get enough sleep, or maybe when we do drugs, even alcohol. I've seen something as innocuous as alcohol trigger psychosis for somebody. Now, this person was diagnosed schizophrenic, and it didn't take much to put him over. But it may be that some of us are sensitive to that sort of thing happening. And this is just a theory. Brain damage is another one. If you have brain damage that happens to any part of your brain that's responsible for visual processing or auditory processing, you can develop hallucinations from there. UTIs, urinary tract infections, in older people cause psychosis. There's any number of explanations for this, but I would never rule out paranormal. I just can't. Who can't? You can't do that. You can't just take something off the table because you don't like it or it's not in line with your ideology. That flies in the face of any kind of scientific endeavor. So that I hope I gave you a slightly more satisfying answer. I know that's probably still not doing it for you, because from what I could hear from your story, you are convinced that you saw this. And so I believe that you saw this.
Right.
And
so I'm sorry, go ahead.
And so we don't, the truth of the matter is, as unsatisfying as it is, modern psychology, modern medicine has no explanation for you other than, well, it could be this, and it could be this, and it might be this, and, how fruitless. And I'm so sorry, Jeremy, but it could be a combination of these things. And maybe that's hard to believe. I don't know what your reaction to this is, but you might be thinking, no, it wasn't sleep deprivation. It wasn't stress. I know what I saw. And then from my perspective, I would refer you to all the patients that I have that they know what they saw was real. They know they did. There's somebody who, had committed a murder because at the time a voice in their head told them to do it, and they believed that really happened. So as scary as it might be, the idea that, no, I know what I saw, I remember it, I felt it, all my senses were there. You can't even trust that, because there are plenty of examples of people who know that they saw it, they know they heard it, but it wasn't there. A demon did not tell you to kill your neighbor. They just didn't. At least that's not what I believe. So it's murky. It's very murky.
Well, I've got to say, certainly my experiences felt real. I also know just how powerful the brain is, and regardless of whether what I witnessed was real or wasn't real, I perceived it as being real. I was frightened.
Right.
It was real enough that I actually sought help at the risk of being labeled something.
Sure.
But I think I'm okay now, because I'm not frightened anymore. It hasn't happened again. But I think when looking at anything paranormal, and I'd like to just kind of point out to my audience that we should be skeptical, and I think to just absolutely sit here and say, I know it was real, I can't do that. It sure felt real, and I would probably lean that way, but there is an alternative explanation that should be considered. I'm still on the fence, I guess, and I hate to go through all this to come to that conclusion, but my God, it sure felt real.
Oh, of course, and it was real to you. And from a therapeutic approach, that's really all that matters is that it was real to you. And it may have been something paranormal. I love that you take a skeptic's view, despite maybe possible evidence to the contrary. Mm-hmm. It's just great that you are willing to take a scientific view, because once you commit to something, once you absolutely definitively say, I know it's this, I know it's a ghost, or I know it's schizophrenia, or whatever, you are ruling out anything else. And now you're no better than anybody else who's just standing in their camp. The most, what do they say? The most true thing about science is I don't know. Yeah. You have to start from that point of view. So my hat's off to you for keeping an open mind. It's part of the reason I wanted to come on your show. I appreciate your approach.
Well, thanks. And I think it as far as your experiences went, where you had a shared experience, I've had a few shared experiences in my life too. That experience, from my surroundings, looking at other drivers on the road when I was viewing this thing, I would say just in that aspect alone, it's probably a weaker experience because no one else shared it. There were no witnesses that could corroborate, yes, there's something that I'm reacting to on a rooftop over there.
Right.
So that said, there are a lot of things that are shared that just can't be discounted, I think, right off.
Absolutely. And your instinct is to think, well, if everybody else will see it, I'm sorry, let me start over. If everybody else saw it or heard it, then it's true. It's evidence. But then again, there's something called shared psychotic disorder. We did an episode on this. Mm-hmm. People will collectively have a psychotic experience. There's a story of a family, a mother and a son. They had just lost their dad/husband, had passed away, and subsequently fell into some financial troubles now that he wasn't, around. Mix that with the grief of losing, their dad or husband. One day, I'm not going to get the story quite right. Check out my episode for the exact verbiage. But essentially, one day the son saw a bug on a pillow, and the mother called the mother over and said, "Hey, there's a bug on this pillow." And she's like, "Oh yeah, okay, sounds like no big deal." Well, if you fast forward, the story rapidly spins out of control to the point where they are going into emergency room after emergency room, telling the doctors that they're infested with bugs that will pop out of their skin and explode into dust. Yeah. I mean, things that's not behavior of insects. That's not a thing, So, and these people had no history of mental illness. No, nothing. It was the grief and them playing on each other that got them to this hallucinatory state. So even it turns out you can't even trust other people trying to be accountable with you, because that mob mentality will click in and you will feed on each other. And you can see this if you've ever sat around and told a ghost story, sitting around. And I've done that where I'm talking to friends and we start to tell some spooky stories or whatever. And 10 minutes ago, I was fine. I was not feeling any kind of sensations of fear or anything like that. And then we get a little bit into the story. We start talking about creepy stuff. And then before you know it, I'm looking over my shoulder. I'm feeling paranoid. I'm feeling anxious. These are all emotions that I have fabricated within my own mind. And it's obvious to me because 10 minutes ago, I was fine. There's just, and then look at, religions. Native American populations, for example, often report part of their ideology is, seeing spirits, hearing things, communicating with inanimate objects, things like that. And is that to say that every Native American is schizophrenic? No, obviously not. If a Christian talks about praying every day and talking to God, nobody questions that. It's perfectly accepted. But if you just frame it in a slightly different way, if you take out the religious component, the socially accepted component, and you stand outside of the box and say it. Now you're crazy. Now it's not true all of a sudden. So it's very touchy indeed, you know.
Well, I think there was only one other area or condition. I don't even know if it's called a condition or not, but that might explain some people's symptoms for experiencing paranormal phenomena that we haven't touched on, and that's sleep paralysis. So I was hoping you could kind of walk us through your definition of that and kind of what the brain does during that.
Okay. So when you sleep, your brain has a switch in your brain in there somewhere, where when you're going through a dream cycle, your brain will disconnect your mind from your body, rendering your body essentially paralyzed. While you're in this state, while you're sleeping, you're unable to physically move. And the reason for doing this is because your brain doesn't understand that what you're dreaming isn't real. And your mind doesn't know the difference. And this is why sleepwalking is a thing. People will get up and wander into the kitchen and start fake cooking on their stove, even though there's no pot in their hands, or they'll wander out of the house. I mean, sleep disorders get pretty dangerous to the point where you're wandering into traffic and you don't know it. We have an episode coming up about insomnia, and we're going to dive into exactly this, the effects of a lack of sleep and insomnia can play on you. But anyway, so while you're sleeping, while you're dreaming, your brain disconnects from your body to prevent you from getting up and walking around and acting out your dreams and potentially hurting yourself or somebody else or whatever. So while you're in this state, you're not able to move. Some people report waking up during this event and still not being able to move because that switch has not come on yet. Or they will talk about having a lucid dream where they understand they're dreaming. They know it's a dream. And I think everybody's experienced that at least once.
Right.
But in reality, your brain's still connected from your body and you're not able to move. I've had a dream like that where it's scary and it's sort of this, you're in your dream banging against the proverbial wall saying, let me out, and you can't. Another thing that comes to mind is people who are anesthetized during surgery. They won't be the anesthesia will work so that they're rendered paralyzed, unable to move, but still be conscious during the event, which is a horrifying experience. Because you can still feel, if you're under surgery, you could feel somebody cutting into you. You can feel and hear, and it's as if you were actually laying there awake, but you're paralyzed. So there are certain conditions where people will, the dream world and the reality world will convolute. But yeah, sleep paralysis is a pretty terrifying thing. It's not something I personally deal with, thank God. But, I feel bad for those that do.
Yeah, same here. I don't think I'd wish that on anybody either. Well, I just want to say thank you for, again, joining us on Deviatus. And let's, if you would mind plugging your podcast and where people can find you and follow your work on the World Wide Web.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You can follow us on Twitter at UPC Podcasts. I have my own personal one at UPCMD. Any Corey Stewart fans out there on Unpopular Culture, she's at CoreStew91. We have a Facebook page, UPC Podcasts. Our website is upcpodcast.com. We have an archive of all of our shows that we've ever done, and I'm really proud of the website. We have just started a Patreon group. So for $1, we try to give people their money's worth. We have bonus episodes. I'm currently working on a project called Manson versus Jones that was inspired by a listener that had written in asking about, well, what's the difference between Charles Manson and Jim Jones? And I was like, well, what a great question. So now it's turned into this whole deep dive project. So there's all these side projects that will be available to patrons. We air on Tuesdays, so we're usually a weekly show, although occasionally I will try to drop a bonus episode when I can. We alternate, now that season 2 has launched, we alternate between episodes and what we call unplugged shows, which it's essentially 2 different shows. The episodes are narrative music. It's just me. It's more of a deep dive. The Unplugged episodes tend to be more panel shows. I try to get my colleagues and friends and whoever's willing to come on the show, and we sit and talk about various topics. And then finally, Corey Stewart and I are covering The Psychology of Black Mirror, one of my favorite shows.
Yes.
And yeah, it's just a beautiful show. There's a lot of, spoiler alert, there's a lot of horrible British accent impersonations on the show. But if you can get past that, we try to take the meaning out of each episode and really psychoanalyze it in a really fun way. And Corey is just incredibly passionate about this show, more so than me, I think, although I do love the show. But it really just brings us amazing enthusiasm. So we're weaving that in. But it has its separate feed. So if you typed in Psychology of Black Mirror, you would find a feed just for that, even though it's hosted by us. So please subscribe and leave us a rating if you want. We always love feedback. We always love your questions. Email us at hello@upcpodcast.com if you have questions, comments. Sometimes we read them on the show. I think that about covers it. Yeah.
You gotta tell us what your patron's nickname is.
Well, the dollar ones. First of all, the button is called. You click on the button, and instead of becoming a patron, you become a stalker.
That's great.
And the dollar level is the intimacy seeker. You'd have to listen to our stalkers episode that just came out to understand, but there are different types of stalkers that increase in severity. So the high-end patrons are the high-end stalkers, the really super hardcore ones. So it's kind of fun.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I look forward to your next episode coming out. I'll definitely be tuning into that one with the whole sleep deprivation history of mine.
Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, it comes out Tuesday. It's called The Bystander Reloaded. We revisit the bystander effect in the case of Kitty Genovese. That Netflix documentary called The Witness had just come out not too long ago. And so we talk about that, and we re-explore the issue of the bystander effect, which is pretty insane. Pretty insane indeed. Scary stuff.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, and you have a great rest of your weekend here.
Thank you, Jeremy. I appreciate your time.
I want to say thanks to Michael for our conversation. I'm always excited to hear perspectives that offer alternative explanations for some of these paranormal phenomena that are so difficult to understand and seem so real. I think we owe it to ourselves to consider all possibilities and not jump to any conclusions. You'll find all the links mentioned on this episode in the show notes at deviatus.com. If you have not been to the website for a while, I highly encourage you to check it out. I have made some significant changes to help you find any of my previous episodes, including a searchable archive. If this was your first time listening to Deviatus, or if you've never reached out to me before, please shoot me an email and let me know a little bit about yourself and how you found the show. As always, please rate and review the show if you haven't already. It does help people with similar interests find the show. And do check out the Unpopular Culture podcast. I hope you have a great week, and I will catch you next time.